Hi, my name is Allison Zamuda, and I'm so thrilled to invite you to our 60-minute conversation around crafting goals that matter for students. So welcome to what we affectionately call, Ben and myself, as the landing page. So you can access this by going to learningpersonalized.com/Lower Merion. And on that page are all of the sessions that Ben and myself and Heidi and myself are doing for the summer PD. So if you just scroll down to Crafting Goals That Matter, you'll see the link to the Zoom recording, which is not here right now because we're doing it live. So you'll see that there, as well as an example and the opportunity for you to connect based on the conversation that we're going to be having, as well as some other examples that you might be interested in. Okay, so based on that, we are going to move into the presentation itself. And I would love to introduce Benna Kalick to start engaging in the conversation. So I will make it start, and then Benna, take it away.
Okay, so here we are, and good day to you all. We're going to be crafting goals that matter for students. You know that goal setting is one of the important things that we can do with our students. And regardless of whether we're with them face-to-face, whether we're in hybrid, whether we're in remote learning, we can always be driven by goals as long as the goals motivate us and they make us feel like we really want to do them. So what we're going to do is we're going to share with you first what we all have probably learned over this time. And it's something that I think we're all struggling with, which is how can we help our students become more self-directed as learners? Now more than ever, we're really expecting that of them. And then we're going to be looking at that and helping to define it by saying there are really what we would call three component parts to it. One is about self-managing, the next is about self-monitoring, and finally about self-modifying. And then we're going to think about what kinds of questions can we ask students that prompt them so that they pay attention to these particular ways of looking at self-management and self-direction. So let's get started by just looking at this to begin with. How do we really define all of this?
So as you're starting to step back and reflect on what does it mean to be self-directed, as we were all thrown into a remote learning environment, there was a real challenge to design work and get things prepared for students in a remote situation that also needed to be balanced by some of the personal challenges that not only students were facing at home, but you too were facing at home. So when it comes to not only being self-directed in your world as a teacher, the other kind of opportunities of continuing to grow self-direction, for example, in your children or whoever was living in your house at the time. So when you're starting to step back and think about, when you say self-directed, what kind of visual comes to your mind? Here are two examples of what came to Benna and myself's mind as we started to think through that. The first, you'll see a compass, and the idea of a compass is that it feels like all of a sudden you have a lot of time on your hands. And what can you do with the time on your hands as a student, right? What can you do with your free time or downtime, but still in a stressful quarantine-like situation? So the notion of a compass and feeling like you can be the steward of your own journey. That's a little bit different from what you see on the right, where people are moving exactly where they need to be or where they need to go. So the intention, especially with the umbrellas, is that people are very directed on location. I need to go from where I am, not just across the street, but to a particular place. Nobody is looking up at the sky and sort of appreciating the rain that's coming down. Nobody is actually looking around with a dazed and confused idea. And again, that's something that some students, as well as you, might feel that you're on a race to go from one to another to another. Ben and I have definitely experienced that as we're paying attention to hopping from one Zoom call to another. So again, you're going to take a moment right now and in the chat, what images came to your mind? And then give a beat and start to think about other ideas that are being shared by your colleagues. So we're going to pause for about 2 minutes and then we'll come back together again.
So we're sure that you had some very powerful images, such as ones that we had, because we're all wondering right now, not only about self-direction, but we're kind of directing ourselves with not sure where it's all going to take us. So we're living in a place in which the self-direction, in a sense, gives us a sense of control when in a situation in which we feel like there's so much that we have no control over. And as we're doing that and thinking about that, we need to be reminded of the fact that the habits of mind can also be helpful to us, because they really help us to, as we often say, they help us to know what to do when we're really not sure what to do. And there was never a better time for us to practice these habits than right now. So we really need to think about this. And when we're trying to think about how do we set direction, how can we really do that? Well, the first thing is that we want to be sure that we're metacognitive, that we're thinking about our thinking, that we're aware of that we're trying to find, as we might say, the executive function, the ability to really say to ourselves, what is it that we need to do to really be helpful to us? Now, you know that there are many of these habits of mind that are really coming into play. For example, we need to be managing our impulsivity if we're going to set a direction. But what we really are trying to say is that metacognition, that being aware of your thinking, will be a really important habit to pay attention to here. And then the second one is to be questioning and problem posing, which is what kinds of questions arise for us? What might motivate us? What might help us to set some goals? So in this, we're really looking at these habits of mind and selecting them as ones to pay particular attention to. And then,
So as you can see, when you're thinking about that level of metacognition, who better to actually engage in that rather than the learner? So the important part is that this is something that teachers continue to want their students to engage in, to be more self-directed. But at the same time, the opportunity is vital. So you can start to see that right now on the slider, it's within the teacher-generated space. So I can tell students, we're hoping that you'll be more self-directed. But if they don't have structured opportunities, if they don't have modeling and illustrations, if they don't have strategies and support structures, the opportunity to continue to move into self-direction may be very limited. And it's especially challenging when students are going to be continuing to be either in a hybrid situation or a virtual learning situation for some or most of the year. So with that in mind, we just wanted to briefly share with you that we do know a little bit about becoming self-directed through research. And there have been countless studies on the subject. And this is a particular study that, again, is highlighting decades of work on the subject. And the two highlights that are called on your screen in front of you is that first, if you're wanting to grow self-directed learning, you must have the explicit teaching of that. And then second, just because you teach it doesn't mean that it sticks. So the opportunity of creating time to actually learn how to do it from a student point of view and reflect on how it's going when you're continuing to become more and more in control of your self-direction. And I think the final piece is really thinking about the opportunities to engage in that. So when we're designing work for students, and we really do need them to actually engage in looking at a rubric, for example, and beginning to see that not just as an end piece, I've done the rubric, check, 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 but actually beginning to pay attention to that, to guide their thinking, to guide their process, and use that as a checkpoint, even if it's not called out overtly by the classroom teacher, as an example. Benna?
So as we think about that, and we realize that there's really some component parts to becoming self-directed, what we're calling perhaps some, as I said before, some key ideas, some key thinking. The first is around self-managing. And what we're suggesting here, and we'll go into more depth around this in each one of these, but what we're thinking about here is that self-managing is really about how do you take care of yourself? How do you manage yourself? Self-monitoring is along the way as you're processing. What are some of the things that you need to do to continue to process your goals? And by the way, your goals don't stay stable. There are times when something leads to something else and you find you have to modify your goals. You have to regroup yourself. And then you're moving to become more self-modifying. So nothing says that you really are setting goals that are fixed in cement. What you're saying is you're setting goals that give you the direction in which you're going. So Absolutely. This is really the idea of becoming self-directed towards something that ultimately may be a long-term goal, but you're taking some short-term moves to get there.
And that's why it's so important that students not only see what you're doing to set goals on their behalf, but beginning to engage with you in the conversation so that they not only are becoming more capable of these three, what Ben and I affectionately call selfies, but also start to see the level of responsiveness, not only in the work, but also in the goal setting.
So you are now going to be looking at some of these, and what we're going to suggest to you is that you'll have an opportunity to document and to think through some ideas that really come to mind to you that help you to kind of think about how you would explicitly teach, how you would prompt for reflection, and how you would make certain that you're really providing new opportunities for students to practice becoming more self-directed. So just to say to you that you'll have an opportunity later in this session to actually document your ideas. So if you want to, jot down some thoughts, keep in mind what you have as ideas. If something springs to mind, don't lose it, because we're going to give you a chance to then actually more formally document it and collaboratively work on it.
And in the first one, when we're talking about self-managing, we'll give you an opportunity after the self-managing part is over to do that chat. And so we'll pause the presentation to collect a couple of your thoughts and ideas and read other ideas together in the chat. But the rest of the other two selfies we'll run through, and that way you have an opportunity to document your thinking for about 15 minutes of time. Sound good? So we are starting with progressively growing self-managing, where Benna was a moment ago. So if you can take a moment and read from left to right, if you can. So the intention when you're starting on the teacher-generated side, it is the opportunity for students to engage in a conversation with you, but they're following the structure that the teacher is suggesting. As you're starting to move into more of a co-created mode, students are beginning to understand and appreciate different ways, different options they have in how they might pursue particular tasks. Maybe it's adjusting the sequence of what they're doing first and what they're doing next. Maybe it's around the opportunities to process ideas and text differently. So continuing to give them clarity on how they can continue to make small shifts, small ideas, small moves, does continue to grow their capacity as self-managers. And finally, from a learner-generated point of view, students are very much entrusted to organize their own learning and figuring out what to do, when to do it, where to do it, and potentially how to do it. And when you're in this learner-generated space, you are very adept at an asynchronous learning experience. But as we're trying to grow that capacity in our students, giving them an opportunity to practice being in an asynchronous environment is incredibly helpful as we continue to move through these ideas. So let's look at a concrete example. If you can take a look at this example, which comes from Hong Kong International Elementary School. And in this particular school, they streamlined one learning target for each day. This was something that the families had an opportunity to see a whole week schedule. But from the student-facing point of view, they got to click into one day at a time, especially because these are younger learners. So in this particular example, they are starting to see what the agenda for the day is for them. So it's broken down into subject areas you can see from left to right, like reading, writing, math, social studies, and Chinese. And then the second point is that they're starting to see what is expected to be done first and next and last, as well as how you're going to demonstrate your learning and when that learning is due. And the intention of trying to grow students' capacity in when I'm doing step one, what is it that I'm expected to do in that space? And to what extent can I actually engage in different ideas, different choices, like you can see in the math, the optional activities. So it doesn't mean that I have to do all three of them, but to what extent can I actually locate things that are interesting or fascinating to me, or perhaps I'm looking at it through a different lens. If I need to really continue to practice more, how can I use those optional activities to engage in practice? So
I was just going to say, just to add to that, Giselle Martin-Kniep has been looking at surveys from students. She has examples of over 500 surveys of students who were, what did you learn? What surprised you most, sort of thing. And she has found in the 500 that almost 80% of the students, K to 12 really, have been saying, not K so much, let's say, but the ones that were 3 to 12 were saying that one of the things that they found most profitable about the remote learning was that they had a choice about when they were going to study what they needed to study.
Yes.
That they really felt like the fact that sometimes they woke up and they got in and they didn't feel like doing math right away. So they went into reading. Now that creates a bigger challenge for secondary if we're in class. But when we're out of class, that kind of asynchronous, make up your own routine, which is a lesson we may think about that we want to change when we're in class together. Yes. But certainly students are saying that. So it supports this idea that we can lay out the expectations and give kids the opportunity to do more self-managing.
Absolutely. So as we're moving on for questions to consider when you're self-managing, take a quick read. So the intention of really trying to visualize that slider again, when you're moving from teacher-generated to making it so that students are becoming increasingly capable of self-managing. How do we model that in the beginning of the year? What kinds of things are we trying to model? How can we actually show students, perhaps overtly with a slider in mind, that what we're trying to do with them, as opposed to doing learning to them or for them? So you have a moment right now in the chat to share an example of a prompt or a strategy, for example, that you might be doing right now to help students become more self-directed. And to what extent does that example and looking at the other examples give you clarity that A, this is not your first rodeo in focusing on this, but B, to continue to think about in what ways can I use some additional strategies from my colleagues? And in what ways can I actually continue that drumbeat? Because sometimes we lose sight of it as the school year progresses and we become more and more anxious about covering our curriculum. So when do we actually slow down and do some direct instruction? When do we know that for certain students, they have that well in hand? All right, so all of that can be sort of thought through and imagined in your chat, especially in the opening weeks of school. So again, we'll pause for about 4 to 5 minutes and then come back together again.
And I assume that some of you have also, who are in early childhood classrooms or with younger kids, are thinking, well, wait a minute now, how can I really make this work where the kids become more self-managing? And it just occurred to me when Allison was talking, and perhaps it's already in your chat, was a teacher who storyboarded what the kids were going to do. So in kindergarten class, she had them draw a picture of what they were going to do first, what they were going to do second, what they were going to do third, and they created a flow chart of it so that they learned how to actually see themselves and see how they were going to move from one thing to another. So it's just really beginning to ask ourselves the question again, how are we really going to be looking at this? And so this next question is about self-monitoring. And I would just want to give you a notice that we're not going to stop for chat after each one of these. So now that you've got the hang of it and you're seeing what it's like, make your notes, jot them down, and when you have an opportunity, you can return to them. But here we're going to look at self-monitoring. So just take a read for a second on what self-monitoring is all about as we move from teacher-generated to our learners generating. One of the key things that we're trying to say, and I think it's interesting to notice this, in the middle, when you're co-creating, notice how students begin to learn how to set tiny goals. And one of the things that we're thinking about here, and it's referencing tiny habits, which is a way that someone is talking about this from Stanford University. But to say that behaviorally, if we set small goals that we can actually accomplish, we begin to then build upon that to have larger ones and larger ones. And so we get in the habit of achieving our goals. And so this is really where we're co-creating what's a small move that I could make that would give me the opportunity to celebrate the fact that I did it and that I could move to the next level, which takes you to students beginning to learn how to monitor themselves, how begin to think about the idea that in the process of working, rather than taking on the whole enchilada, I'm just going to take a small piece of it. I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to see how that works for me and grow it. And I begin to learn how to independently do that to manage myself. As I'm self-monitoring, for example, here, I may look at this because I get formative assessments. And when I get formative assessments, it kind of tells me, okay, this is how I see myself at this time. Here's what I see that I'm really pretty good at. Here's some stuff I'm still practicing, and here's some stuff I know I still need to learn. I've gotten some external feedback about that. I realize where I am in my learning, and now what can I do about that? So here I'm taking a small move and I'm saying, here's what I might do. I can show and solve addition facts, but here are some strategies that I might use that will help me to really get better at it. So I'm beginning now to be monitoring my performance as I move along the way, not waiting to say I've done it all, but just to take a small move and make it possible for me because I also identify the strategies that will help me most.
And they're doing this in consultation with the classroom teacher. So the classroom teacher in this, for instance, actually drafted what you see in black letters on the second part of your screen. And the intention is whether you're conferencing with the students one-to-one and determining which of the three ideas might be interesting and helpful based on what you know about the student and what you know about how they're progressing so far. But when you're doing that, to try to really continue to tune into the idea of self-managing. The more you take over again, the less likely students will continue to have their voice as part of the conversation. So again, really starting to tune into listening with understanding and empathy in that regard, and giving them the space to actually share their thinking first about what they think might be a good idea.
So in what ways do we actually promote this? Where do we find the opportunity that feedback is more than just here's how you're doing, but actually co-creating what you do about where you are and how you're doing? So how do we make that possible? And again, I think what we've learned over this remote learning opportunity, and we can call it an opportunity, although we didn't ask for it, but it became an opportunity for a lot of learning. And one of the things we learned is students really like to get more feedback as they're progressing. And if we want them to become more self-monitoring, we have to model that through the way that we give them feedback. So what are some possible ways that we can document the observations we make? How do we have perhaps set up a one-to-one conference with students? How do we have Zoom calls or whatever you're using, where you might just have a small group and you might actually have the students working with one another? And then we also see the possibility that at this point in monitoring your work, you might use the protocol of critical friends. You might actually say, pair up and look at each other's work. What reflections do you have as you think about how might we design prompts to coach for thinking and progress as we're moving along, not just waiting until the very end?
So the last one is self-modifying. And one more time, if you can read from left to right. The power of what classroom teachers can do to support learners, even when they're learning in an asynchronous way, is still incredibly stunning and important. So as we're starting to look at this from the teacher-generated side to the learner-generated side, the teacher conversation and voice can actually be enshrined in the supporting tools that you're giving the students, so that they're engaging with you when you're not physically there to give them overt feedback and guidance when they need it. So as you're starting to think about this and take a look at it, that students begin to have an increasing role in their level of ownership and action when they need it. For example, if you're looking at the co-created idea, that students begin to ask for on-demand feedback. So how do they actually get a hold of you, especially when you might be engaged with another group of students if you're doing small group instruction or you're following a bell schedule? So the intention of really trying to think through that overtly is going to be incredibly important, so that when students need help as they need it, there may be ways of continuing to provide that level of assistance, whether it's through Remind, whether it's through office hours, or whether it's through a help desk that potentially is staffed by other students or additional staff members in your building. As you're also starting to think about what they're doing when they ask for on-demand feedback, the opportunity for them to give voice to the questions that are on their mind and the things that they are not only concerned about in their work, but things that they really would love for you to take a look because they feel like they've accomplished something. So the idea of trying to grow students' capacity in their the questions that they're asking in their proactive way of troubleshooting problems and continuing to grow their ideas. So let's take a look at a couple of concrete examples in relation to this. So the first example is an example in English language arts. This was drafted by a group of middle school English language arts teachers. And I took a screenshot of it immediately because I thought it would be really helpful in showing the kind of orientation that can happen even when this was drafted within about a 30-minute time window. So first on the first column, you're starting to see the kinds of questions that students wanted to have in the piece. So what's especially important to me when I was writing this piece? That was something that a student very much wanted to have on the chart to indicate that sometimes I was focusing on one thing, but that's not what the teacher was commenting on. So I have an opportunity to clarify that before the teacher is beginning to read my piece of writing. What strengths does the piece of writing possess? Again, to try to continue to emphasize leading with a strengths-based mindset as opposed to a deficit-based mindset. And that's not only true from a teacher point of view, but very much from a student point of view, because oftentimes many students are worried about how they're writing. And to the notion of starting to have them actually engage in a strengths-based mindset is also helpful and important. And then the third question, as you continue to revise this piece, what do you need to pay attention to? That gives you a highlight from a teacher's point of view on where might I actually spend more time with my student as we continue to conference about their work. And are there moments of direct instruction, whether I'm doing that one-to-one or I'm giving them a follow-up piece of a video or tutorial or an example for them to study and take a look at? That's something that could also be on my mind. And last, what can I, the teacher, do to help you become a better writer? So the students are actually engaged in looking at this and responding to it before coming to the conference. This is something that can be done as easily on site, as well as you can see, this is again in a Google Doc, the students can actually do this in advance. And then the teacher and the student engage in a conversation, as well as the student and teacher on the bottom are taking next steps or actions. Benna?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one thing. I really love this example. And I think what I hope we can keep in mind is this is still the teacher prompting the reflection. But the teacher is giving the student the kinds of things that they might then internalize and begin to ask of themselves. So if we're moving on that slider from co-created to student self-generated, all the questions that we ask, I think it's really important that we're modeling for them what could go on inside your head, the metacognition. What could go on inside your head that would tell you that this is important? What goes on? What questions are you asking? So even, for example, when it says, what can I, the teacher, do? It could really, what goes on inside my head? Who could give me feedback that would help me with this writing or would help me become a better writer? It begins to shift from you, the teacher, me, the student, here's what I'm doing with you or for you, to me knowing what am I learning about myself and how do I begin to initiate my own ways of learning better and improving my work.
And I think the power of what Benna is suggesting now is that these reflective prompts can actually be the way you start the school year. But as you continue to go, giving the opportunity for students to reflect on what reflective prompts actually are more helpful to me, whether it's from this list or potentially new prompts that actually are more connected and relevant to my particular area of focus. But let's say you're not an English language arts teacher. Let's take a look at another concrete example. So this is problem solving. This one particularly is focused in a math classroom. And you can see the full rubric in all of its glory on the landing page. And when we go back to the landing page, I'll just point it out to you for a quick second. But the intention here is that as I'm growing students' capacity to problem solve, I'm really trying to hone in and pay attention to the process pieces along the way. For example, really understanding the problem as opposed to headlong racing into answering or the solution. So the intention of the criteria in green, understand the problem, and then the reflective question, what's the problem really asking me to do? The other part of this, especially from a classroom teacher and a student point of view, is that this particular district is very invested in habits of mind as well. So they wanted to call out a particular habit of mind, and then because they wanted to demonstrate the clean connection between the content of mathematics and the skill of growing my capacity as a mathematician, they also highlighted math practice standard number 1 and 2 in this particular endeavor. So the full rubric again is on the landing page if you're interested in pursuing it and looking at it further. So one more time to start to think about the questions for consideration about the ways we provide opportunities for students to self-modify. When can we actually think through feedback on their terms as opposed to our terms? We often schedule students to go through a cycle of feedback so that we're managing our class load, as opposed to starting to think about, has a student ever said to you, I'm not ready for feedback yet? And so I think that's the dynamic, especially in a virtual classroom, we can really start to take advantage of. Oftentimes they may not be ready for feedback yet, but they also may prefer to get feedback in another way. So they may prefer to have a comment rather than having a 20-minute conversation. Or they may love to hear your voice when they're ready for it. So you can actually do a quick recording around a particular sentence or an aspect of a problem or responding to an idea that they're generating or developing. So these questions that we have gone through here are also part of the documenting opportunities for self-directed learning. So the same 3 questions that you saw throughout this first chunk of the presentation are very much embedded in this particular example. So the idea here is that in your small teams or small groups, you will move to the Google Doc and work together on just one of the 3 selfies. You're going to either take self-managing, self-monitoring, or self-modifying. And as a team, whether again, it's 2 or 3 people, or we recommend upwards to 6, not bigger than that, so we can make sure that everybody has a voice, you are going to engage in looking at this Google Doc. So I'm opening it up right now. And as you can see, self-managing is up on the top. So these are the 3 questions that were in the slide deck. And then the groups are here. So group 1, it might be Benna, myself, and Heidi. We're together. We're going to spend about 10 minutes just responding in our particular row for group 1. If the rows continue to get filled, obviously you can go here and then you can add a new row in underneath so you have your own space to do it. And finally, it's important to grow all 3 of the selfie ideas to continue to grow their capacity in self-direction. So if you are looking at this and say, you know what, self-monitoring hasn't had a lot of people hanging out in it, maybe that's an area that we might want to dive in and go into. All right, so we're going to leave you for about 10 minutes or so that you can settle into the document. And if you're wondering where this document is, one more time, you can actually go here to the learningpersonalized.com/Lower Merion, scroll down to crafting goals that matter for students. By the way, here's the problem solving rubric. And then there's the Google Doc for documenting opportunities for self-directed learning. You pop it open and there you are. All right. So we'll see you back again in about 10 to 15 minutes time. And when you're ready to come back, we'll be here to meet you. Thanks. Benna?
Progressively goal setting, growing goal setting. One of the ways that we're going to be doing this is through the act of questioning, of being able to really make sure that we're questioning. So if we can look at that next slide.
Do you want to give folks an opportunity to read from left to right for a sec? And I think it's incredibly important that as we started talking about the capacities of self-directed learning, this last part is really grounded in growing the students' own capacity to set their own goals. Oftentimes we have content that we want to explore with them, skills that we want to practice with them. So whether it's an extension of growing goal setting in the territory that we are accountable for as part of our curriculum, or potentially engaging them in conversations around what other aspirations they might have. Thinking about extensions like a Genius Hour and Makerspace. And they can do that not just in a school setting, but they can also potentially engage in that at home. Thinking about the opportunity of what you're seeing with your own children and the kinds of habits and new ideas they pursued when they had some time in quarantine.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that for a moment and remembering any number of teachers who have talked with me about the idea that we're doing project-based learning. And we're doing project-based learning, but we're chunking it into manageable chunks. Yeah. Because you can't really, if you're not sure you're going to be with them and coaching them all the time, and you don't want them to just do it separately outside of the academic environment. So how do you keep that learning environment potent and dynamic while you're doing a project? And what I'm seeing here is that you need to develop some questioning strategies that you're going to use that are really going to invite their thinking as they're setting their goals. So let's just walk through a few strategies that really invite students to become more thoughtful as they're doing, for example, the idea that they're going to set goals. So here you are, and you're about to start your project. And I think it's important for students to begin to realize that the first idea isn't always the best idea. And that sometimes you have multiple ideas and you're not sure which ones of those are going to be the most profitable. So I'm asking you to set goals at this time, but I'm using plurals. And the reason I'm using plurals is because you may have more than one. So I'm asking, what are some of your goals? What ideas do you have? What outcomes do you seek? Notice that every place where I'm using a plural, I'm suggesting there may be more going on your mind. Now, my point in these questions is to draw out your thinking, not to project onto it my agenda. So I'm not saying to you, well, tell me what your goal is, and then I can help you think about, well, let me give you some advice. Let me network you. Here's some good idea. I'm really saying this is a time for you to think about your thinking. And I'm asking you to say, what are some of your goals? Think about that. I'm sure that you're not sure about what it is, and I'm encouraging you to muddle your way through your thinking.
Yes. And one of the sessions that Ben and I drafted in the last one was around pause and the opportunity and the power of pause when you're engaging in conversations with the students. Because students potentially feel like the first goal is the only goal, or they may actually create a list of goals, but they are looking to the teacher to tell them which goal do they like the most. So the interesting dynamic of really starting to use listening with understanding and empathy and pausing can continue to create an opportunity for students to continue to sift through ideas, outcomes, and goals, and then begin to feel more connected to this as a conversation as opposed to another hurdle they're jumping over.
And this is really critical to self-managing, because when you've set your goals, you're really beginning now to be managing yourself. And so don't rush it. This is what I would call the planning part of any project.
Yes.
The planning part is doing that. Then you're really beginning to think about this from another perspective, which is the self-managing in terms of what might be some factors that would impact your learning. You're asking them now to begin to think about things that might actually impact, for example, the time, the resources, the materials. A lot of things can go on here that you can really help them with. So as you're planning, for example, for a project, this tentative language is really important, again, because you, the person who are asking the questions, you're coaching for them to think it through. Again, our goal on the slider is we're always trying to help them to internalize the kinds of questions that will help them to be asking them to themselves, so that the next, maybe after 3 times of projects, for some kids, maybe 5 or 10, you want them to get it inside their heads. I'm making a plan for this, but what might be something that would impact this? And might signifies that you don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. You don't know the answer. I'm engaging you in thinking about what actually the answer might be.
That's right. And that helps them not only in the beginning part of the process, but throughout, because they can continue to see that level of resiliency, that persisting, but also really starting to think about, when might I need a little more support? When might I need a soundboard? When might I need another resource? So that continues to help the student not only anticipate, but also feel like they can continue to rely on those questions further along down the journey.
And then these are what we call invitational stems. And invitational stems are about really saying, I'm going to try to give you sort of the mental cues. In other words, when I invite you, I also am inviting a particular kind of thinking. And when I'm doing that metacognitively, I'm making you aware, for example, if I say, as you recall, then the cognitive process I'm asking for is go back, apply past knowledge. What is it that you recall? And of course, when we're working from a strengths-based perspective, the recall, the remembering, the learning what you've already learned, the remembering that something worked or didn't work, what the strengths of it were, all of that is really part of your developing the habit of realizing that you can use past knowledge to inform the present. As you anticipate is asking another question of you. It's really asking you to begin to predict, a very important cognitive skill. So it's basically saying, as you anticipate doing this project, now you recalled, perhaps, and now I'm asking you, well, what do you anticipate might happen? What are some of the conditions? What are some of the things you might be worried about? As you envision, I'm asking you to be more visionary. As you envision might draw upon the habit of creating, imagining, and innovating. It might be that at this point, you're imagining something really unusual. As students often say, they want to be able to think out of the box. Well, you may have just opened the portals to a new box. So as you envision, what are some of the things that you're imagining? And then when you say, given what you know about, what you're saying there is, I know you already know something. So don't act as if this is the first time you ever thought about it. Given what you know about this, tell me a little bit about what you've thought about, what you know, what you've learned. But notice each one of these is asking for a different cognitive process. And it's really asking you to be more thoughtful about your planning, about what you're going to manage, about how you're going to monitor what you're doing, what you're deciding to do, and then obviously at the very end, reflecting so you can draw upon it next time. When I ask you, as you recall, your reflection should have solidified to some extent the language in your head that says, here's what I did and here's what I learned from it. So it's all about thinking about this from a planning perspective, from a processing perspective, and from a reflecting perspective.
So as you're continuing to think through this, please in your chat one more time, if you want to share questions that you typically ask in relation to the conversation that we just shared with you on growing students' capacity to set goals. Benna was talking about the significance and importance of doing that in relation to a project, whether it's something that the students have decided to do, or it's directly tied to an interdisciplinary or a content-based topic in your classroom. And also start to begin to read other people's examples to continue to build your repertoire. So this is the last chat of the conversation, and we're hoping that after that's over, you can begin to take some action by applying learning from this session. When you're starting to revisit that Google Doc with the self-managing, self-modifying, self-monitoring, and also start to think about how you might continue to address self-directed learning in your class. But thank you so much, and we hope you continue to have a restful summer, as well as some level of excitement and energy and vitality for your opening of school next year. Thank you.
Thank you. See you in the fall.